So as I've talked about before in my blog, I absolutely love feature flags. They have revolutionized the way me and my team deploy code to production. And I use feature flags all the time in my Angular applications, but what I've never done is use a feature flag to completely change an entire view rendering. Usually I just expose or hide the entry point, such as a link, to a particular feature. So I wanted to experiment with conditionally rendering a view inside of the Angular router. So for example, let's see, I have my home here and I have projects, and you can see this is my list of projects, and if I click into the project I get the detail, and you can see that the ID here changes, and I have this app projects ID route. Now what I want to do is be able to use this mock feature flag to change the implementation of the projects list. So for example, if I turn the feature flag on, I don't want to dynamically change it at this point, but if I go back to home and now I go back to projects, notice that the rendering of this list has completely changed, but the project detail remains the same, and this ID continues to dynamically update as I move through the project selection. Right, I can go back to home, I can go back to projects, it's the same. If I refresh the page, which resets the feature flag, notice that the implementation of the projects here has returned to the feature flag off addition. Now the way that I was able to do this is that I use an intermediary view component that dynamically renders the projects list implementation based on the feature flag. And if we look at the elements here, what we can see is here's the router outlet inside my app component, and when I click on projects, I'm not rendering the projects list directly. Instead, I'm rendering this app project switcher. Now notice that the apps project switcher is at the same DOM level as the router outlet, which is also at the same level of the dynamically rendered element. So right now I'm doing app projects alt, the alternate implementation, and if I were to turn this off and come back, you can see now I'm doing app projects, the existing implementation of the projects list. And I have my project switcher, of course, which is doing the actual dynamic rendering. So let's take a look at how this works. Actually, first I just want to point out that the routes remain exactly the same, which is what was critical for this exploration in my mind, right? App projects 2 for the existing implementation. If I turn it off and I come back here, you can see I'm still at app projects 2, even with the alternate implementation of the projects list. And this was important to me because I didn't want to break any existing routes. Say if someone bookmarked or linked to another user who didn't have the feature flag turned on, it was important that nothing broke, that the URL route system remained seamless. So let's take a look at the module to see how this routing is configured. So here's my app module, and you can see I have my router module that I'm pulling in here. Now at the projects path, where I normally would have rendered my projects component, you can see that instead I'm rendering this projects switcher component. And then it, just like its project list would have children, and you can see if there's a project ID, then I'm doing the project detail, but it's this project switcher component that's really doing the magic. This is what's taking the feature flag, evaluating it, and then determining which view component to render as a sibling of the router outlet. And let's take a look now at this project switcher to see what's going on. So here's my project switcher. You can see it has no real template, and it's in fact hidden using CSS. But what it does have is access to the 2 different projects list versions. It also has access to the user config service, which it's injecting here. And when this component initializes, it looks at that feature flag is using new hotness, and if that's turned on, it gets the factory, the component factory for the alternate implementation. Otherwise it falls back to using the existing project list implementation, and then it simply creates that instance of the component inside the view container ref. Now the view container ref is the containing element for this project switcher. So essentially what this is doing is creating this component here as a sibling to the current component inside of the view container ref, which is why when we look at the elements, we can see that the project switcher renders the selected component as a sibling, which is what the router outlet is doing as well. The router outlet is rendering its component, its configured component, as a sibling of the router outlet. So by using the project switcher intermediary, but using the component factory and using the view ref, the view container ref, we're essentially mimicking, to some degree, the behavior of the router outlet. So we're minimizing the changes to the actual DOM tree structure, right? We're not wrapping this element in a new component, which would fundamentally change the way that the DOM tree is structured. Instead, we're just adding this additional element sibling, but not fundamentally changing the ancestor-descender relationship of the routable components. Now, this is the first time that I've ever used the ComponentFactoryResolver, so I should say that my experience here is a little bit different than the documentation, which may be an Angular 9 thing or maybe an issue with me. I don't know. In the documentation, it says that the dynamically rendered components are supposed to be recorded as entry components, but for me, adding them to declarations seemed to work, and in fact, adding these to the entry components did not work. It complained about some sort of ng module reference. So I don't know if I'm doing something wrong or if this is the fact that I'm using Angular 9 Next, and this is some sort of breaking change perhaps. I don't really know. My experience here is very experimental. And then let me just show you in the app component so we can see how this feature flag mockery works here. You can see that the app component injects that user config service, which is what the intermediary switcher component is also injecting. And when I say yes or no here for the feature flag, all I'm doing is setting that true false value on the user config service. This user config service literally has nothing in it but this readable, writable property, which again is what the switcher component is using here. The actual implementations of these views aren't very interesting. They have no logic in them. They're just essentially they're the same exact view but with different less files. So not even worth looking at. You can look at them on your own. Really what I wanted to show you here was the fact that this feature flag drives the routable view or the renderable view within the routes while maintaining the same route structure. So again, if I go back here and I turn this off, and then I go to Home, and I go to Projects, you can see I have the different implementation. In fact, I can just use the browser's back button, right? So if I turn this on, and then I go to Home, and then I hit back, you can see that I go back to that same list with the completely new implementation because the intermediary rendering component there was able to reevaluate the feature flag. So again, just an experiment for me. First time I've ever played with dynamic component rendering in Angular 2+. But this is definitely very exciting for me because it does fundamentally prove that I can use the feature flag to completely change the rendering within the router while seamlessly maintaining the existing route structure. And that's a pretty key part of this exploration in my mind.